Teacher shaves black girl's head at school. Then her father brings her to court. The room was heavy with the sound of the classroom clock ticking, the monotonous hum of fluorescent lights above, and the soft scratching of pencils against paper. Ariel Daniels, a 12-year-old girl, sat at her desk, her eyes focused on the page before her. She was in the middle of her sketch when Miss Brooks's sharp voice cut through the stillness of the classroom. "Ariel Daniels, what do you think you're doing?" Ms. Brooks's tone was cold and authoritative. Ariel's hand paused in midair. Her heart skipped a beat, and she slowly lowered her pencil. The moment felt like it had stretched longer than it should. Her gaze never lifted from her drawing, though her fingers trembled slightly. "Just finishing my notes, Ms. Brooks," Ariel replied softly, her voice barely audible. Ms. Brooks's footsteps echoed in the quiet room as she walked toward Ariel's desk, the click of her heels growing louder with each step. "Notes?" she scoffed, her voice laced with contempt. "I'm not blind, Ariel. That's no math problem you're working on." Ariel remained still, unwilling to engage. She had learned long ago that silence was her shield. Ms. Brooks snatched the journal from Ariel's desk and began flipping through it with disdain, her lips curling into a disapproving frown. "These drawings are why your grades are slipping, Ms. Brooks muttered, as though speaking more to herself than Ariel. Ariel's eyes lowered, her heart sinking in her chest. It wasn't true. She was one of the top students in nearly every subject, but Ms. Brooks didn't care about facts. She was too focused on her own agenda, and in that moment, Ariel knew she couldn't change her mind. She had no voice here. The classroom grew heavier with each passing second. The whispers of the other students, the glances exchanged, the shifting of seats, all of it filled the room like thick, oppressive air. It wasn't just Ariel that Ms. Brooks disapproved of. It was everything that made Ariel her. The braids she wore so carefully every day, the ones that covered her alopecia, her medical condition that kept her from growing a full head of hair. "These braids, Ms. Brooks said, her voice dripping with judgment. "So elaborate, so flashy. So distracting. Don't you think they're a bit much for school?" Ariel's stomach turned. Her hands clenched at her sides as she fought to keep her composure. She wanted to explain herself, to tell Ms. Brooks about the alopecia, about the way her mother had made arrangements with the school for her to wear the extensions. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Not to Ms. Brooks, not today. As Ariel remained silent, the buzz of the PA system broke through the tension. Principal Wexley's voice filled the room, droning on about the dress code enforcement. "Attention, students," he said, his tone impersonal. "This is a reminder that our strict dress code will be enforced starting today. All students must comply with the appearance standards outlined in the handbook. Thank you for your cooperation." Ariel sighed, the sound barely escaping her lips. Ms. Brooks's eyes lit up, as if on cue. She glanced down at Ariel's braids, her lips curling into a smug smile. "Isn't that just perfect timing?" she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Ariel could feel the heat rising in her face, but she remained silent. She didn't want to draw attention. She didn't want to fight. She just wanted to finish the day, go home, and forget this ever happened. "Stand up, Mrs. Daniels," Ms. Brooks ordered, her voice firm. Ariel's legs shook as she stood, her heart pounding in her chest. The class stared at her, some with curiosity, others with judgment. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear their whispered comments behind her back. But she kept her gaze firmly planted on the floor as she walked to the front of the class. Ms. Brooks was circling her now, like a vulture eyeing its prey. "Class, this is a perfect example of a dress code violation," she announced, her voice cold and clinical. These braids are excessive. They're distracting. The handbook clearly states that hair must be neat and conservative. This is not neat. This is a spectacle. Ariel's throat tightened. She couldn't breathe. The weight of the words pushed down on her chest, suffocating her. She wanted to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Not now. Not when she was already drowning in humiliation. "Miss Brooks, please," Ariel whispered, her voice small. "I have a medical condition." Ms. Brooks ignored her. "If you have something to say," she cut in, "the whole class should hear it." Ariel swallowed hard, her hands trembling. She tried to speak again, louder this time, but the words caught in her throat. "I have a medical condition," she said, her voice shaky. "My mom got permission from the school for my hair." Ms. Brooks's eyes narrowed. "A medical condition that requires fancy braids? That's a new one." She turned to the class, her tone mocking. "See how students will say anything to get around the rules." Ariel's heart shattered. The room felt like it was closing in on her. No one spoke. No one defended her. She was alone. "You either take those extensions out right now, Mrs. Brooks snapped, "or you'll be sent home. Your choice." Ariel's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't. My mom—" "Your mother isn't here," Ms. Brooks interrupted, grabbing Ariel roughly by the arm. "Let's go. We'll sort this out in the nurse's office." The tears finally spilled over as Ariel was dragged down the hallway. Maya, her best friend since kindergarten, shot her a sympathetic look from across the room, but Ariel couldn't bring herself to meet her gaze. Her world had just crumbled in front of everyone. She wanted to run, to hide, but all she could do was follow Ms. Brooks's iron grip as they marched to the nurse's office. As they entered, Ms. Brooks called out to Nurse Adams, "This student is in violation of the dress code." "She claims she has some sort of medical condition, but I have my doubts." Nurse Adams looked up from her computer, her expression concerned as she took in Ariel's tear-streaked face. "What seems to be the problem?" "Her hair," Ms. Brooks said flatly. "It's against regulations." "I have alopecia," Ariel said, her voice trembling. "My mom filed paperwork. Please check." Nurse Adams hesitated, looking between Ariel and Mrs. Brooks. "Let me see." "Don't bother," Ms. Brooks cut in. "I already checked her file this morning. There's a general medical form, but nothing about hair exemptions." Ariel's stomach turned as the truth was twisted into lies. She tried to speak again, but the words didn't come. "You either take those extensions out," Ms. Brooks continued, "or you'll be sent home." Ariel sat in the nurse's chair, her heart heavy as Nurse Adams reluctantly brought out the clippers. Ariel wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but she felt helpless. The sound of the clippers buzzing filled the small room as Ms. Brooks shaved Ariel's head, piece by piece. The braids that had hidden her condition fell to the floor, each strand a reminder of the humiliation she couldn't escape. Ariel's hands reached up to feel her scalp, her skin cold under her fingers. She wanted to disappear. Finally, when the buzzing stopped, Ariel was left sitting in the chair, nearly bald. She looked at herself in the mirror, a stranger staring back at her. Ms. Brooks didn't care. She didn't care that Ariel's world had been shattered. She didn't care about Ariel's condition. All she cared about was control. Ariel's whole body shook with silent sobs as she sat in the chair, too overwhelmed to speak. Her thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Eric Daniels sat in the living room, staring at his phone, his hands trembling with every passing second. The message from the school had been brief. too brief to contain any real understanding of what had happened. He had heard the distress in his daughter's voice when he picked her up earlier that afternoon, but nothing had prepared him for the sight that greeted him when he walked into their home. Ariel sat on her bed, her knees pulled up to her chest, the hoodie from Maya draped around her shoulders like a shield. Her face was pale, drained of the usual spark that defined her. The room was silent, save for the sound of her soft breathing. Eric's heart broke as he stood in the doorway. He had been prepared to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but nothing seemed right. The silence between them was suffocating, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely helpless. "Baby," he finally said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I should have been there for you." Ariel didn't respond. She didn't even look up. Eric took a deep breath, gathering his courage before walking over to her. He sat down on the edge of the bed and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Ari, talk to me. Please, I don't know what to do if you don't talk to me." She slowly turned her head to look at him, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "You can't fix this, Dad," she whispered. "They took my hair." Her words were like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just hair. It was a part of her identity, her way of coping with the alopecia that had plagued her since she was 9 years old. It was the one thing she had worked so hard to protect, and now it had been stripped away. "I know, baby," Eric said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know they did something terrible to you, but we're going to fix this. We're going to make sure this never happens again." Ariel pulled the hoodie tighter around her, as though trying to bury herself inside it. How? How are we going to fix this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They don't care about me, Dad." "They don't care about anyone like me." Eric's heart shattered as he watched his daughter struggle with the weight of the world on her small shoulders. She was just a child, but already she had learned the hard lesson that the world wasn't always kind to people who looked like her. He knew the fight ahead of them would be uphill. The school would try to bury the incident. They would dismiss it as a misunderstanding, a lapse in judgment, but he couldn't let them get away with this. He couldn't let them destroy his daughter's sense of self. "I don't know how yet," Eric said, his voice steady but firm. "But we will fight. I'm going to make sure they pay for what they did to you." As he spoke, Eric's mind raced with the possibilities. He had been in the military long enough to know how the system worked. He had fought for years to protect his country. Now he would fight to protect his daughter. Later that evening, Eric called the school. He had tried to reach Naomi, but she was still on a classified operation overseas, and communication was difficult. He left several messages, each more urgent than the last. But the school's response was predictable. A vague statement, a one-day suspension for Ms. Brooks, and assurances that they were investigating the matter. But Eric wasn't buying it. He knew what had happened wasn't an isolated incident. There was something more going on, something that went beyond the teacher's actions. His gut told him that this wasn't just about a dress code violation. This was about power, control, and a system that had failed his daughter. The next morning, Eric sat in the kitchen, staring at his phone, trying to keep his mind clear. Ariel had barely spoken since he picked her up, and he wasn't sure how to break through to her. The only sound in the house was the faint hum of the refrigerator. A knock at the door broke the silence. Eric stood up, his muscles tense, and walked over to open it. It was Maya, Ariel's best friend since kindergarten. Her mother stood behind her, a look of concern on her face. "I'm sorry to bother you," Maya's mom said softly, "but I thought you should know. Maya recorded everything. She got it all on video." Eric's heart skipped a beat. Maya had recorded the incident? His mind raced with the possibilities. If the video was as incriminating as he suspected, it could be the key to bringing the truth to light. "Where is it?" Eric asked, his voice tight. Maya handed him her phone, and Eric's eyes quickly scanned the video. His stomach churned as he watched Ariel being dragged down the hallway by Misu. Brooks, her face streaked with tears. The video didn't capture the full extent of the humiliation Ariel had endured, but it was enough. Enough to make the world see what had happened. "Thank you," Eric said, his voice barely a whisper as he handed the phone back. "You've just given us a fighting chance." With the video in hand, Eric knew they had to act quickly. He needed to get this to Naomi. He needed her back home. As the day wore on, Eric's frustration grew. He had tried calling the school district, demanding answers, but they continued to stall. He had left a message for Principal Wexley, but there had been no response. It was clear that the school was trying to downplay the incident, hoping that it would blow over. But Eric wasn't going to let that happen. He called an attorney, someone he knew could help. After explaining the situation, the lawyer agreed to meet him the next day to discuss their options. The wheels of justice were turning, but slowly. Eric wasn't sure how long it would take to get results, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stop until his daughter had the justice she deserved. The night dragged on, and Eric finally fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from the weight of everything. But his mind wouldn't let him rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ariel's face, her tear-streaked face, as she sat in that chair, her braids falling to the floor, her dignity stripped away. He couldn't let that go. The next morning, as Eric stood in the kitchen, the phone rang. It was Naomi. Her voice, though calm, carried the weight of a woman who had just learned that her daughter had been victimized. "I saw the video," Naomi said, her voice tight with emotion. "What do you need from me?" Eric took a deep breath. "I need you home. We need to make them pay." Naomi's silence spoke volumes. She understood what was at stake. She understood the fight that lay ahead, and she was ready. "I'm on my way," she said, her voice steady with resolve. As Eric hung up the phone, he felt a surge of hope. They weren't alone in this fight. They had each other. And together, they would take on the system that had failed Ariel. The battle was just beginning, but Eric knew they were ready. They had a plan, and this time, no one was going to ignore them. The cold steel of the courthouse doors pressed against Naomi's hand as she stood outside, watching the bustling crowd of reporters and protesters. The news had spread like wildfire. For the past 24 hours, her phone had been ringing nonstop. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, but this wasn't just another headline to her. This was her daughter's future, and she wasn't about to let anyone steal it from her. Naomi straightened her uniform, taking a deep breath as she walked through the doors. The courthouse, cold and impersonal, felt more like a battleground than a place of justice. She wasn't here to make a statement. She was here to make sure her daughter's voice was heard. Eric had already arrived, sitting in the waiting area, his face tense with anxiety. The lawyer they'd hired, Grace Yamada, was pacing back and forth, her expression steely as she spoke in hushed tones with another attorney. "We're ready," Grace said as Naomi approached, her voice calm but determined. "We've got everything we need. All we need now is for you to stand strong. For Ariel." Naomi nodded, glancing over at Eric. She could see the worry in his eyes, but there was also something else, a quiet resolve. The past few days had been a blur of emotions, but now it was time to take action. This wasn't about the past anymore. This was about the future. "Have they filed the formal complaint yet?" Naomi asked, her voice low. Grace nodded. "We've got the full documentation, including the video. We're filing this as a civil rights violation," assault, negligence. We'll take them all down. Naomi felt the weight of the situation, but at the same time, a fierce pride rose in her chest. They were fighting for Ariel and for every other child who had ever been made to feel small by an institution meant to protect them. "Where's Ariel?" Naomi asked, her voice softening. "She's with the support counselor," Eric replied. "She wanted to be here, but I think it's just too much for her right now." Naomi understood. Ariel had been through enough, but Naomi also knew that her daughter wasn't going to let this go. Ariel had a strength Naomi had always admired, a quiet fire that burned bright, even when the world tried to snuff it out. They were called into the courtroom, and the tension in the air was palpable. The room was filled with reporters, some from local news outlets, others from national networks. The defense team, led by Principal Wexley's attorney, was already seated, their expressions cold and calculating. Naomi kept her gaze steady as she walked to the front, her boots clicking against the hard floor. Every eye in the room was on her, but she didn't flinch. She was used to commanding attention, but this wasn't about her. This was about Ariel. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Alana Barnes, called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Grace was the first to speak, her voice clear and powerful, as she laid out the charges against the school and the teacher, Mrs. Brooks. "The case before you today is not just about one child's trauma," Grace began, her eyes scanning the room. "It is about systemic abuse, the abuse of power, and the failure of those entrusted with our children's safety." The defendant, Ms. Brooks, not only violated the dress code but humiliated a 12-year-old child in front of her peers. She shaved that child's head, knowing full well that the child had a medical condition, knowing full well that the child had been granted an exemption for her hair. And yet Ms. Brooks chose to disregard that exemption, choosing instead to humiliate her in the most public way possible. Naomi clenched her fists at her sides as Grace continued, detailing the evidence. Ariel's medical records, the video footage, the statements from the nurse and witnesses who had seen the assault firsthand. The case against the school was strong. It was airtight, but Naomi knew better than anyone that no case was ever truly guaranteed. The system could be broken, but that didn't mean it wouldn't fight back. When it was the defense's turn, Principal Wexley's attorney stood up, adjusting his glasses as he addressed the court. "Your Honor," the attorney began, his voice smooth and rehearsed, "we acknowledge that a mistake was made. But what we have here is a simple case of miscommunication." Ms. Brooks, while perhaps too firm in her approach, was merely trying to enforce the dress code, a policy that the school has had in place for years. There was no malice, no intent to harm. This was a lapse in judgment, nothing more. Naomi could feel the anger rising in her chest. This was exactly what she had feared. They were trying to downplay it, to turn it into a simple mistake. A misunderstanding. But it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate cruelty. And she wasn't about to let them get away with it. "Miscommunication?" Naomi whispered, barely audible. But the words were enough to catch Eric's attention. He turned to her, his jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They both knew this wasn't about a dress code. This was about power, control, and the destruction of a child's dignity. The defense continued, but Naomi's mind was elsewhere. She thought about Ariel, how fragile she had looked when she walked through the door that afternoon, how she had refused to speak, how she had curled into herself, her small body trembling with the weight of it all. Naomi knew she had to stay focused. She couldn't let the defense control the narrative. She couldn't let them twist the truth. The next few hours dragged on as both sides presented their arguments. Naomi kept her eyes on Ariel, who was seated at the back of the courtroom with the counselor. The girl looked so small, so vulnerable. But Naomi knew better. Ariel had always been stronger than she let on. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, It was time for the witness testimonies. Grace called Ariel to the stand. When Ariel stepped up, there was a collective intake of breath. The sight of her, still bald, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf, sent a wave of shock through the courtroom. She was standing tall, though. She was standing despite everything. Ariel's voice was soft, but it was steady as she took the oath and began to speak. "I was just drawing in my journal," she said, her eyes focused on the floor. "Miss Brooks told me my hair was against the rules. I tried to tell her about my condition. I tried to tell her that my mom had filed the paperwork, but she didn't listen. She just made me go to the nurse's office. And then she shaved my head." She didn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Tears welled in Naomi's eyes, but she held them back. This was Ariel's story, and it had to be heard. She had to be strong for her daughter. This was the moment everything had been building toward. As Ariel finished her testimony, there was a silence in the room. A thick, heavy silence that felt like the calm before the storm. Naomi didn't speak, but her gaze never wavered from Ariel. The battle wasn't over, but this was just the beginning. The courtroom was silent, a heavy hush hanging in the air as the jury filed back into the room. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest, every beat thundering in her ears as she sat beside Eric. Ariel was just behind them, wrapped in the quiet comfort of a bright scarf, her face still vulnerable but determined. She had remained so strong, so composed throughout this nightmare. Naomi admired her courage, but deep down she could see the cracks, the fragile parts of her daughter's spirit that had yet to heal. It had been 3 weeks since the assault, and every day felt like a battle. A battle to protect Ariel, a battle to hold the school district accountable, a battle to make sure that this kind of injustice didn't happen again. Not to their family, and not to anyone else. The judge, a woman named Judge Ilana Barnes, had already made it clear that she would not tolerate any games. This trial would be swift, fair, and relentless in its pursuit of the truth. The defense, led by Wexley's attorneys, had tried to paint this as a simple mistake, a misunderstanding. They had tried to argue that Ms. Brooks, the teacher, had merely been following protocol, that she had been overwhelmed by the chaos of the classroom. But Naomi knew the truth. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate act of cruelty. Grace Yamada, their attorney, had been a pillar of strength. She had meticulously laid out the evidence, showing how the school district had ignored Ariel's medical condition, how the paperwork had been filed and disregarded, how the video captured the cold, unfeeling way Ms. Brooks shaved Ariel's head. Grace had made it clear that this wasn't about a dress code. It was about power. It was about abuse of power. And it was about Ariel's right to be safe in a place that was supposed to protect her. Now, as the jury settled in their seats, Naomi's thoughts turned to Ariel. The girl had barely spoken since the incident. She had withdrawn into herself, a shell of the confident, creative child she used to be. Naomi's mind raced as the moment stretched out, the tension palpable. Grace stood up, her voice cutting through the silence as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Grace began, her voice calm but firm. "You have heard the evidence. You have seen the video. You have heard the testimonies of the witnesses. And most importantly, you have heard from Ariel Daniels herself. This is not a case of miscommunication. This is a case of deliberate harm." Ms. Brooks, knowing full well that Ariel had a medical condition, chose to disregard the exemption she had been granted. She chose to humiliate Ariel. She chose to strip away her dignity, and she did it with the full support of the school district. This is not an isolated incident. This is part of a pattern of behavior, a culture of cruelty that must be stopped. Grace's words echoed in the room, and for a brief moment, Naomi could see the effect it had on the jury. She had always known that Grace was a formidable lawyer, but now, in this moment, Naomi felt a rush of gratitude. This woman was fighting for their family. She was fighting for Ariel. The defense's attorney, a man named Lawrence Whitfield, stood up, his suit pristine and his demeanor calm, but there was a tension in his eyes. He addressed the jury with practiced ease, his voice smooth but lacking conviction. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Whitfield began, "we acknowledge that this incident has caused pain, but this is not an issue of malice. This is a matter of a teacher trying to enforce the rules in a school that is struggling to maintain order." Ms. Brooks, though perhaps too harsh in her methods, was simply doing what she believed was necessary to maintain discipline. There was no intent to harm. And while we understand that Ariel Daniels has a medical condition, there was no official documentation presented to Ms. Brooks that would have exempted her from the dress code. This was a miscommunication, a misunderstanding. Naomi felt the rage building inside her, but she kept her face neutral. She couldn't let him win. Not today. "You will hear from Ms. Brooks shortly," Whitfield continued, "and she will explain her actions. But the truth is simple. Rules must be followed, and when they are not, consequences must be enforced." There was no malice here, just a teacher trying to do her job. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Naomi clenched her fists, but she didn't react. She had heard these kinds of arguments before, teachers trying to hide behind their authority, principals trying to shift blame. But this wasn't about rules. This was about Ariel. This was about justice. "Your Honor," Whitfield continued, "we will also demonstrate that Ms. Brooks was not aware of any exemption for Ariel's medical condition. She acted in good faith. She was simply following school policy." Naomi could feel her heart pounding in her chest. It was hard to breathe, hard to listen to this man twist the truth, to deny the cruelty that had been inflicted on Ariel. The judge, a woman who had been silent through most of the defense's statement, spoke now, her voice firm and authoritative. "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield," Judge Barnes said. "We will now hear from the defendant, Ms. Brooks." Ms. Brooks stood up, her face pale but composed, walking to the witness stand with a certain rigidness that made Naomi's skin crawl. Naomi could see it now, the way the teacher's hands shook slightly as she held the Bible to take her oath. This woman wasn't as confident as she appeared. She wasn't the authority figure she had been in the classroom. She was a woman who had made a choice that she would have to answer for, as Mrs. Brooks began to speak. Naomi's thoughts drifted back to that day in the nurse's office. The sound of the clippers, the look in Mrs. Brooks's eyes as she shaved Ariel's head, as though it were a punishment, as though she were stripping away Ariel's identity. Naomi could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she stayed focused. Ariel needed her to stay calm. Ariel needed her to fight for her. Ms. Brooks's voice broke Naomi's concentration. "I was just enforcing the rules," Ms. Brooks said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I didn't mean to humiliate her, but the rules are the rules. And Ariel had been defiant. She wasn't paying attention in class. She was drawing instead of doing her work." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. The lies were piling up. She could hear the defense's attorney prompting Ms. Brooks, guiding her words like a script. But this wasn't a story. This was real life. This was Ariel's life. "Did you know about Ariel's medical condition?" Grace asked sharply, cutting through the lies. "Did you know that she had alopecia?" Ms. Brooks hesitated. I wasn't aware of the full details," she said, her voice faltering. "But I was told that her hair was a distraction, and I needed to do something about it." Naomi's jaw clenched. She could feel the truth slipping through the cracks. This wasn't just a simple case of enforcing rules. This was a deliberate act of cruelty. "You were told by who?" Grace pressed, her voice like steel. "Miss—" Brooks faltered. "By the principal. Mr. Wexley," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Naomi felt the weight of the moment. Principal Wexley, the man who had been so quick to cover up the incident, so eager to protect his staff at any cost. She had known it all along. The school wasn't just guilty of one mistake, they were complicit in the whole thing. The courtroom was silent as Ms. Brooks's testimony ended, and Naomi felt a sense of victory surge through her. This was far from over. But they had made progress. Ariel's truth was coming to light, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The courthouse was buzzing with reporters, their cameras flashing as Naomi, Eric, and Ariel made their way through the crowd. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation. The media had latched onto this case, and they weren't about to let go. Every news outlet in town had sent a team, some even from out of state, all hoping to capture the final moments of this landmark trial. Naomi kept her head high, eyes focused ahead. Ariel walked beside her, her small hand gripping her mother's, but the girl's gaze remained downward, a quiet strength behind the veil of silence she had worn since the incident. Eric, his face a mix of resolve and exhaustion, stayed close, offering his silent support. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. It had been a long trial, but today, everything was coming to a head. This was the moment they had been building toward, the day of the closing arguments. This was when it would all come down to the last words, the last chance for the defense to save face, and the last chance for justice to be served. Naomi sat down in the front row beside Grace, who was flipping through her notes one last time. Eric sat behind them, his face etched with worry. Ariel, as always, was quiet. Naomi knew this was hard for her. It had been hard for all of them, but they couldn't stop now. They couldn't turn back. They were so close to the truth, to the moment when everything would be laid bare. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent. Naomi felt the weight of it all, the air thick with expectation. Judge Barnes, the stern woman who had presided over the trial, sat at the bench, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, and today was no different. Grace stood up, adjusting her blazer, and walked to the front of the room. She looked at the jury, her gaze unwavering, before speaking in a clear, powerful voice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "you have heard the testimony. You have seen the video. You have heard from Ariel herself, and now we ask you to consider the evidence we have presented. The school district, the teacher, and the principal all failed this child. They failed to protect her. They failed to listen to her. And worst of all, they failed to take responsibility for their actions." Naomi sat up straighter, her fists clenched tightly in her lap. The words from Grace were a reminder of everything they had fought for. They were so close now, but there was still a long road ahead. "This isn't about hair," Grace continued, her voice rising with intensity. "This isn't about a dress code. This is about power. It's about the power to control, to humiliate, to strip away a child's dignity." Ms. Brooks, who acted as if she were above reproach, who thought she could violate a 12-year-old girl's basic rights without consequence, must be held accountable, and the school district, which has shown no remorse for the way they mishandled this situation, must be held accountable as well. Grace turned and looked at Ariel, who was sitting silently beside Naomi, her hands folded in her lap. "This is Ariel's story," Grace said, her voice softening. "Ariel's courage has brought us here today. She has shown us that it's okay to speak out, even when the world is telling you to stay quiet. She has shown us that one voice, one truth, can change everything." Naomi's heart swelled with pride as she looked at her daughter. Ariel may have been quiet, but her silence was powerful. Every step of the way she had been brave, even when she didn't have to be. "Now, the defense will tell you that Ms. Brooks made a mistake," Grace continued. "They'll say she was just doing her job, that she was following the rules. But we know the truth. Ms. Brooks didn't make a mistake. She made a choice. She chose to hurt a child. She chose to humiliate her. She chose to strip her of her dignity, and that choice was made with full knowledge of the harm she was causing." Naomi's fist tightened even more. The words were harsh, but they were the truth. The truth that the defense didn't want to hear. The truth that Ms. Brooks and Principal Wexley had tried so desperately to hide. "We've shown you the medical records," Grace said, her voice calm but insistent. "We've shown you the video. We've shown you the witnesses who heard Ms. Brooks make those cruel comments, and we've shown you the truth. Ariel was violated, and now it's time for justice." Naomi could feel the heat rising in her chest. It was almost too much to bear, the weight of it all. But this was it. This was their moment. Grace turned to the defense, her eyes narrowing. Ms. Brooks was not just following the rules, she was following her own agenda. And now, the consequences must be hers to bear. The defense team shuffled, and Ms. Brooks stood up. She was stiff, her expression guarded. Naomi could see the fear in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected someone to stand up to her, to hold her accountable for the harm she had caused. But Naomi was here now. Ariel's story was here now. And nothing could change that. Ms. Brooks's attorney stood to make his closing statement, trying to twist the narrative, but Naomi wasn't listening. She was focused on Ariel. She was focused on the moment that was coming next, when everything would be decided. The defense attorney spoke, but Naomi's mind was elsewhere. She was thinking of Ariel, of the strength it had taken for her to get to this point, of the pain that was still so fresh but now tempered by the possibility of healing. The defense finished, and it was time for the jury to deliberate. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving Ariel. The room was filled with tension, and Naomi knew that this was the hardest part. Waiting, the uncertainty, the fear of what could happen next. But there was something else, too. Hope. The hope that justice would be served. The hope that they could finally move forward. Together. The courtroom felt like it was shrinking around Naomi, the air thick with tension. The jury had deliberated for hours, their absence from the room only adding to the weight on her shoulders. Every minute felt like an eternity. Beside her, Eric sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the door where the jury would eventually return. Ariel, however, was still. She hadn't spoken much since her testimony, but her presence was strong. Naomi could feel the tight bond between them, an unspoken understanding that they would face whatever came next together. Naomi's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Everything had been laid bare. They had fought tooth and nail to get to this point. But now, as the time ticked by, doubt began to creep in. What if the jury didn't believe them? What if the verdict didn't go in Ariel's favor? She glanced over at Grace, sitting beside her, calm as ever. The attorney had been a rock throughout the trial, but even she couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes. The case had taken its toll on them all. Naomi's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the sky had darkened, the weather mirroring the uncertainty inside the courtroom. Her mind flickered back to the moment when this whole ordeal had begun. The day she had received the video from Eric. The shock, the disbelief, the anger that had surged through her as she watched her daughter's humiliation unfold. She had been miles away, deployed overseas when it happened. The helplessness she had felt, not being able to protect Ariel, had been almost unbearable. But now, standing here, she had done everything she could. She had fought for justice, for her daughter, and for every child who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. And now it was all in the hands of 12 strangers. The door creaked open. Naomi's heart skipped a beat as the jury slowly filed back into the room. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with a stern face, took her seat and looked toward the judge. Naomi's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she thought she might suffocate under the weight of anticipation. Judge Barnes called the room to order. The noise in the room died down, replaced by the heavy silence of expectation. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Barnes asked, her voice steady. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, handing a folded document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Naomi's hands clenched into fists, her nails biting into her palms. She could feel the coldness of the metal in her hands, the sharp edge of the weight. Judge Barnes read the document quietly, her face betraying no emotion. The courtroom waited with bated breath. Finally, the judge looked up and addressed the room. "On the count of assault and battery, how does the jury find the defendant?" The foreman stood again, her voice clear and firm. "We find the defendant, Evelyn Brooks, guilty." A wave of emotion surged through Naomi. She squeezed Eric's hand, the pressure a silent acknowledgement that, for the first time in months, they had won. But this was only one victory in a much larger fight. "And on the count of negligence?" the judge asked. "We find the defendant, the Lakeside School District, and Principal William Wexley, guilty," the foreman said. The words hit Naomi like a punch to the gut. The district, the very people who were supposed to protect Ariel, the very people who had turned a blind eye to the cruelty that had been happening under their watch. They were guilty too. "And finally, on the count of intentional infliction of emotional distress?" Judge Barnes asked. "We find the defendant, Evelyn Brooks, and Principal William Wexley, guilty," the foreman said again. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe it. They had done it. The jury had believed them. They had believed Ariel. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, a wave of disbelief and shock rippling through the spectators. The defense team, led by Lawrence Whitfield, was visibly stunned. The attorney's face was pale, his eyes wide as he looked at the jury. Ms. Brooks sat rigidly in her seat, her hands clenched into fists, her lips pressed tightly together as though she were holding back a torrent of emotions. Grace turned to Naomi, her face softening for the first time in days. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline from the victory washing over her. But she knew this wasn't over. The battle was far from finished. "Does the jury find any damages to be awarded?" Judge Barnes continued. The foreman nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $1 million for the emotional distress and medical costs incurred by Ariel Daniels." Ariel's head turned slightly, her eyes lifting to meet her mother's for the first time in what felt like forever. Naomi saw a flicker of something in Ariel's eyes. Hope, maybe even relief. The girl was holding on, and it was in this moment that Naomi knew they could finally start healing. The foreman paused before continuing. "We also award punitive damages in the amount of $5 million against the Lakeside School District, $1 million against Principal Wexley personally, and $3 million against Evelyn Brooks personally." Naomi's pulse raced. The figures were staggering. They had won. Not just for Ariel, but for every child who had suffered at the hands of a system that prioritized rules over compassion, authority over humanity. Ms. Brooks's face drained of color as the magnitude of the damages set in. Wexley, too, was visibly shaken, his usual calm demeanor shattered. They had thought they were invincible, but now everything had come crashing down around them. The judge nodded. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Ariel Daniels, and awards damages as indicated by the jury's verdict. Naomi looked at Ariel, who was still sitting beside her, her face pale but with a small, faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She had survived this battle, and now they could move forward, together. The judge banged her gavel. "This court is adjourned." As the gavel struck, the air in the room shifted. People began to stir, some moving toward the exits, some gathering their things in disbelief. Naomi stood up slowly, taking in the weight of what had just transpired. She reached down and squeezed Ariel's hand, pulling her close. "We did it, baby," Naomi whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Eric stood beside them, his arms around both of them. The room around them was chaotic, but in that moment it didn't matter. They had won. And in this fight for their daughter's dignity, they had made sure that justice was not just a word, it was something that had been earned. As the Daniels family left the courtroom, they stepped out into the waiting press frenzy. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in their direction, but none of it mattered. They had their justice. But as Naomi walked beside her family, her heart was heavy with the knowledge that this was just the beginning. They had fought for Ariel, but there were many more children out there who needed help. And Naomi wasn't going to stop until every last one of them had the same chance for justice that her daughter had. They walked together into the future, stronger than ever. The air in the Daniels home was thick with anticipation. The jury had spoken, the verdict had been delivered, and the world was watching. Naomi couldn't help but replay the moment in her head, her daughter, Ariel, looking up at her with that faint smile after the court ruling. They had won. It was everything they had worked for, everything they had fought for. But even in the aftermath of victory, Naomi knew the battle was far from over. That night, as Naomi sat in the dim light of the kitchen, she reflected on everything that had led them to this point. The long hours of legal work, the endless meetings, the media frenzy, and most of all, the damage that had been done to Ariel. The trauma she had suffered, the humiliation, and the betrayal. How could they ever fully heal from this? The sound of the front door opening broke Naomi from her thoughts. Eric walked in, looking more tired than ever, his face etched with the same worry that had been there since the moment Ariel had first been humiliated at school. "Any news?" Naomi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had been trying to avoid the news all evening, but the weight of what had happened, what was happening, pressed down on her. "Nothing new," Eric replied, slumping into the chair across from her. His eyes were bloodshot, and his shoulders sagged with the weight of the world. The media's still all over it. Every news outlet, every social media platform, it's like we're stuck in a spotlight we didn't choose. Naomi nodded, glancing out the window. The sky was dark, the streets outside silent except for the occasional passing car. "I know, but what about Ariel?" Eric's face softened at the mention of their daughter's name. Ariel had been quiet ever since the trial ended, retreating into her art, her sanctuary. Naomi knew it was her way of coping, but the silence was unbearable. They had won in the courtroom, but the fight wasn't over. It would never be over until Ariel truly healed. "She's in her room," Eric said softly. "Drawing again. But it's different." "Her work. It's darker now." Naomi's heart clenched. She had seen Ariel's artwork evolve over the past few weeks. The once vibrant colors, the swirling joy in her sketches, had been replaced with somber tones. The innocence of her childhood had been stolen, and Naomi wasn't sure how to give it back. "I'm going to talk to her," Naomi said, standing up. "We have to make sure she knows we're here. That she doesn't have to carry this alone." Eric stood too, reaching for her hand. "Be careful. She's been distant. I think she's still processing everything." Naomi nodded, squeezing his hand before heading down the hallway to Ariel's room. The door was slightly ajar, the soft light from the desk lamp spilling into the hallway. She knocked gently before pushing it open. Ariel was sitting at her desk, a sketchbook in front of her. Her pencil moved quickly, the sound of it scratching against the paper the only noise in the room. Naomi paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of her daughter. The girl who had always been full of life, of laughter, now lost in her thoughts. "Hey, baby," Naomi said softly, stepping into the room. Ariel didn't look up immediately, but Naomi could see the way her shoulders tensed. She hesitated before sitting down beside her, careful not to crowd her daughter. "I know it's been a lot, but we're here, Ariel. You don't have to carry this on your own." Ariel's hand froze, her pencil hovering over the page. Finally, she looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, her face pale. "I don't know if I can ever be okay again, Mom," Ariel whispered, her voice so quiet Naomi almost didn't hear it. Naomi's heart broke at the words. She had always known that Ariel was strong, but hearing her so vulnerable, so fragile, made Naomi realize just how deep the damage ran. "You will be okay, sweetheart. It's going to take time. But you don't have to face this alone. We'll be right here with you, every step of the way." Ariel didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slowly turned the sketchbook around to show her mother. Naomi's breath caught as she looked at the drawing, a small, bald figure standing in the middle of a storm, her head bowed, but her stance strong, defiant. "Is that you?" Naomi asked, her voice thick with emotion. Ariel nodded. I'm not sure who I am anymore. I don't know how to get past this." Naomi took a deep breath, the weight of it all settling in her chest. "You are still Ariel. You're still the same amazing girl you've always been. This, what happened at school, it doesn't define you. What matters is who you are on the inside. That's what I see when I look at you. Your strength. Your heart." Ariel looked at her mother for a long moment, before slowly nodding. "I don't feel strong, Mom. I feel like I'm just broken." "You're not broken," Naomi said firmly. "You're just finding your way. And that's okay. It's okay to feel lost sometimes, but I promise you, you're not alone. We'll get through this together." Ariel's lips trembled as tears welled up in her eyes. Naomi reached out, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. She felt Ariel's body shake against her, the sobs muffled into Naomi's shoulder. It was the first time in weeks that Ariel had cried, and Naomi held her tight, letting the moment wash over them both. After a while, Ariel pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know how to deal with everything." Naomi smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from Ariel's face. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. We're taking this one step at a time, and we'll deal with the rest when we're ready. But for now, you're safe. You're loved, and that's enough." Ariel sniffled, nodding. "Thanks, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." Naomi squeezed her daughter's hand. "You'll never have to find out, baby." "I'm right here." Outside the room, Eric stood in the doorway, watching them quietly. Naomi caught his eye and gave him a small smile, relieved to see the quiet support in his gaze. The three of them had made it this far, and no matter what came next, they would continue to stand by each other. As Naomi left Ariel's room, she felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they would face it together. Whatever came next, they were ready. The courtroom was alive with tension, a hum of whispered conversations filling the space as people filed into their seats. It had been weeks since the trial began, but the Daniels family could feel the weight of every moment. They had fought tooth and nail for this, not just for themselves, but for every child who had ever been mistreated in the name of authority. Today, it would all come to a head. Naomi stood tall beside her daughter, Ariel, whose colorful head wrap was the only hint of light in the otherwise subdued room. Her presence was commanding, and despite the overwhelming emotions pulling at her heart, Naomi felt a deep sense of calm. They had made it this far, and now it was time to let justice speak for itself. Eric squeezed her hand, his steady gaze never leaving their daughter. He had been by Naomi's side through it all, every phone call, every sleepless night, every angry moment in the midst of a broken system. But this was different. This moment was theirs. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for fairness, called the courtroom to order. Her gavel struck with a decisive force, silencing the room. "We've reached the closing stages of the Daniels versus Lakeside School District case," Judge Reynolds announced. "The jury has been deliberating. They will now return with a verdict." As she spoke, the Daniels family stood united, facing the jury box. Ariel clutched Naomi's hand tightly, her pulse racing. Despite the progress they had made, there was still fear, still uncertainty. Naomi knew what this verdict meant. It meant everything. The door to the deliberation room opened, and the jury entered. Their faces were calm, but Naomi could see the subtle shifts in their expressions: anxiety, exhaustion, and perhaps a flicker of hope. The forewoman handed Judge Reynolds a piece of paper. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, her voice steady but filled with anticipation. "We have, Your Honor," the forewoman replied, her voice unwavering. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. The moment they had all been waiting for was finally here. The judge reviewed the document in front of her, her brow furrowing as she read the jury's findings. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. "On the count of assault and battery against Ariel Daniels, how do you find the defendant, Ms. Evelyn Rohr?" Judge Reynolds asked, her gaze shifting to the jury. "We find the defendant guilty," the forewoman announced, her voice ringing clear through the hushed room. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Naomi felt a rush of relief wash over her, but she held her composure. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. "On the count of negligence against Principal Wexley and the Lakeside School District, how do you find?" the judge continued. "Guilty," the forewoman replied again, her voice firm. Naomi's eyes met Eric's, and for a fleeting moment, the years of struggle and pain seemed to fade away. This was the justice they had fought for. The fight had been long, but now it felt worth it. The judge moved on to the next count. "And for the intentional infliction of emotional distress?" "Guilty," the forewoman stated again. Ariel's breathing slowed, but the tension in her body remained. Naomi's arms were around her, but she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, just as it had when they first stood before the judge all those weeks ago. This was the moment they had waited for, but what came next was what truly mattered. "Lastly, on the civil rights violation count," Judge Reynolds asked. "Guilty," the forewoman declared, her voice echoing in the courtroom. There it was, the final verdict. Evelyn Rohr, the woman who had humiliated Ariel, had been found guilty on all counts. Principal Wexley had been found guilty as well. The school district, which had tried to cover up the abuse, would be held accountable. But for Naomi, the verdict wasn't just a legal win. It was a victory for every child who had ever been silenced, every voice that had been ignored. The room erupted into murmurs, but Naomi stood still, her hands gently rubbing Ariel's back. Eric pulled her into a tight hug, whispering words of reassurance. "We did it, Naomi. We did it." Naomi nodded, her voice barely audible as she responded, "Yes, we did." But we're not done yet. The jury's determination wasn't just a win for the Daniels family. It was a statement. It was a message to the world that children like Ariel would not be silenced. The fight for justice, for equality would continue. The judge then turned to the matter of damages, and the courtroom fell silent again. This was the part they had all been waiting for. The consequences, the punishment. On the matter of damages, the jury has awarded $3 million in compensatory damages to the plaintiff, the judge said, pausing to let the words sink in. Naomi's heart beat faster, but she remained composed, her hands steady. And in punitive damages, the jury has awarded $5 million against the defendant Evelyn Rohr, the judge continued. $2 million against Principal Wexley, and $1 million against the Lakeside School District. The weight of those numbers hung in the air like a cloud of righteousness. This wasn't just about money, it was about making sure that no one would forget the injustice that had been done, that the pain Ariel had suffered would not be buried under the weight of bureaucracy. As the gavel struck, Naomi felt a sense of closure, but also a new beginning. This battle had been won, but the war for justice was far from over. Naomi looked down at Ariel, her daughter's face still marked by the scars of the past. But now there was something else. A strength. A fire. Ariel's journey of healing had only just begun. As they walked out of the courtroom, Naomi turned to the crowd of reporters waiting outside. The media frenzy had been relentless, but she was ready for this next step. She had something to say, and she was going to make sure the world heard her. Today, Naomi began, her voice steady, we've won justice for Ariel, but this victory is not just about us. It's about every child who has ever been silenced, who has ever been made to feel small. This is about making sure that no other child ever has to face what Ariel did. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of reporters. But this is not the end. This is just the beginning. We will continue to fight. We will continue to speak out. And we will make sure that justice is not just an ideal, but a reality for every child in this country. The reporters' cameras flashed, but Naomi's words carried more weight than any photograph ever could. As she turned to walk back to the car with Eric and Ariel, Naomi's heart swelled with pride. They had fought for justice, and they had won. But more importantly, they had given the world a glimpse into what could be accomplished when ordinary people stood up against injustice. Ariel looked up at her mom, her eyes filled with gratitude. Naomi smiled and squeezed her hand. We did it, baby. We showed them what it means to stand up for what's right. And in that moment, Naomi knew that this was only the beginning of a long and powerful journey. A journey where the Daniels family together would continue to fight for justice, one step at a time. Thank you for following the Daniels family's journey. If this story has moved you, please like, subscribe, and share. Let's continue to fight for justice, equality, and the voices of those who need it most. Together we can make a difference.